This week on BSD Now, we've got all sorts of post-holiday goodies to share. We got new OpenSSL APIs, Dtrace, OpenBSD desktops, and a truly paranoid start to your 2017 security. So keep it all tuned to BSD Now, your place to be, SD. BSD Now, episode 175, How the Dtrace Saved Christmas, recorded January 4th, 2017. Hey, I'm your host, Chris Moore.
And I'm Alan Jude.
And glad to have you with us this week. So look at that. I almost made a mistake. The show notes said 2016. See, I'm going to be doing that for the next few weeks.
We got to fix the template.
All right, but I read it right,
yeah.
So that's all that mattered. So we're good to go. So of course, we welcome you to the first episode of the brand new year, and hope you guys all had great holidays, some great time off, and now if you're like us, you're probably suffering through the backlog of everything you missed over the long weekends. So we're still getting caught up on stuff. So if anybody sent us email or whatever, apologies in advance. We'll get to it. It's in the queue.
I was actually doing my yearly task of archiving old mail from the beginning of last year into subdirectories. So my inbox went from like 58,000 messages to 16,000 messages. Getting rid of everything from the end of October and earlier from last year went into a 2016 directory.
That's good.
And when I was cleaning up my FreeBSD mail, I was like, I didn't even see these emails around New Year's. I think it was Mark Felder emailed developers talking about a New Year's resolution to mentor more people. And expand the project. I'm like, wow, that's a good thing. I completely missed that thread.
Right, yeah.
So much other email happening around New Year's.
There was a lot I missed over the last 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. So anyway, we're getting into the swing of things, though, and looking forward to an exciting 2017. There's lots of BSD stuff that's going to be happening this year. So I suppose we should get right into it first. So our first headline here, we have OpenSSL 1.1, some API migration path, or maybe the lack thereof. So tell us about what's going on there. I guess there's a little bit of a churn going on.
So this is a post on the OpenBSD tech mailing list. So this isn't officially about OpenSSL or anything. It's just discussing what OpenSSL is doing, likely in the guise of what LibreSSL is going to end up deciding what to do. But as many will be aware, with the release of OpenSSL 1.1.0, they intentionally introduce a significant API change from previous releases. In summary, a large number of data structures that were previously publicly visible, so that in your code, when you're using the OpenSSL library, you can just access that data structure, have been made opaque. So you don't actually know what the members are. It's just a pointer to some data. And then there are accessor functions that are used to get and set those fields rather than you doing it manually. This can wrap things like memory allocation and so on so that you can't make mistakes as easily.
Mm-hmm.
It's worth noting.
Hopefully.
It's worth noting that the use of opaque data structures is generally beneficial for libraries since changes can be made to these data structures without breaking the ABI. So it means that there's less breakage going forward after this. But the switch to it is going to be a fairly large breakage. So as such, the overall direction of these changes is largely reasonable. However, while API changes is generally necessary for progression, in this case, it would appear that there is no transition plan and a complete disregard for the impact of these changes would have on the overall open source ecosystem. So in particular, it seems like, so there's the old API and the new API, and you use one or the other.
So why do I sense we'll have to have a separate OpenSSL package report, and then some things link against the new one, and some things link against the old one?
Yeah,
you because both installed
if one app switches, then you need the newer version. But if a second app hasn't switched yet, then you need the old version. And
that's okay. There's only how many tens of thousands of packages out there in the open source. I'm sure they'll all get to it in the next 30 days, right?
That poses an even bigger problem. What about long-term support distros like, say, Ubuntu that have shipped OpenSSL 1.0 something and will be supporting that version until 2018 or 2019?
Yeah, that's gonna suck for a lot of folks. This is I mean, I understand you have to do it, but yeah, the fact that there's no backwards
migration
way to say,
at all, and
yeah,
this is so far it seems that the only approach is to place the migration burden onto each and every software project that uses OpenSSL, pushing significant code changes to each project that migrates to OpenSSL 1.1. While maintaining compatibility with the previous API.
Sure.
This has forced each project to provide their own backwards compatibility shims, which is practically guaranteed that it'll be a proliferation of variable quality implementations, and almost a certainty that some of these will contain bugs, potentially introducing security issues or memory leaks.
Oh, great! So we could potentially create more issues just from doing all the migration.
Yes, to the newer, safer API will actually create issues in and of itself. Then there's the other problem is, or the other approach to it is, if-def soup. So every time you're going to call OpenSSL, you're like, if we're using OpenSSL 1.1, do this block of code. Otherwise, do this block of code. And eventually one of those will rot and it just gets messy and soupy and oh my.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Well, that's that's fun. Okay.
But yeah, like I was saying, the bigger issue here is if one... especially for operating systems that don't have the flexibility of, let's say, the ports tree to deliver the newer version of OpenSSL, if you're stuck in an OS that ships a specific version, like even FreeBSD does that, then you kind of end up in this situation of having to try to mix them. And, if it's just libcrypto.so or whatever, those normally conflict. So, like, are they going to call it, like, libcrypto2.so.1?
That's what I would assume. Like, you'll end up with two sets of libcrypto or libraries, or libcrypto11.so. something.
Did they actually do that?
I have no idea. I would imagine that's something a lot of the packaging systems will have to implement.
Sure, but
on the backside,
if
right?
OpenSSL installed manually does one thing and every package of it does something different.
Oh yeah. No. Hilarity will ensue.
Can you imagine? Can you imagine what the new configure scripts for things are going to start looking like? It's like, I'm going to prod all over the place with every different distro's naming convention to try to find where you might have the new OpenSSL. And then I'm going to look for older OpenSSL. And then I'm going to look for whatever else I can find.
All right. Oh, man.
And of course, it leaves the issue of app A wants OpenSSL 1.0 and app B wants SSL 1.1. And then, how does your package manager allow you to have both of those at the same time? Currently, they're set to conflict with each other. Again, for FreeBSD, so normally FreeBSD could solve this by just making everything use the new version. But you can't.
That's a lot of work.
Well, if it was just the version bump and not an API change, then it's simple, right? You can just compile the entire FreeBSD package tree with the new version. Like we upgrade the version of Perl every so often, and it's not a big deal.
No, that's not a problem
But because this requires each app in the ports tree to be upgraded at its upstream to support the new API, it means that that flexibility we have is not really as helpful.
No. There's a lot of other moving parts aside from just a couple packaging changes. Like I could see them doing a second OpenSSL package so that we have both installed, so we can have legacy things use one and the new ones use the other. But just chasing down all those is going to be a lot of legwork and a total pain in the rear.
And just tracking as each upstream eventually adds support for OpenSSL 1.1. And
they flipped with this commit, so now we're on the new thing. Yeah, it's going to be a very tedious for a while.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for everyone who maintains the SSL stuff. Wait, is that Bernard Spill?
Yep.
He does a lot of that. Yep. Sorry, Bernard.
But it seems like if we do end up needing these backwards compat shims or whatever, it seems like there should be one reference implementation that's well done, that basically looks like the new API, but implements on top of the old API.
Well, it implements the old API, but internally calls the new API, right?
I suppose that way, then the application doesn't need changed. But eventually, what you would want is every app to use the 1.1 API and have a backward shim so that if your OS provides the old API, you can still use it in your newer app.
I bet you it's only a matter of time for somebody does that. I figure somebody will implement the migration more than once.
Yes, well,
be like, screw it, I'm making
there's a Hacker News thread at the bottom here, and there's some people talking about how they already did it with the if-def soup. It's like, yeah, but and that's not necessarily as reusable because unless you've done every possible function in OpenSSL that works for your app, but not the next app.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be interesting also to see what happens with LibreSSL, how they, if they're going to pull this in, are they going to maintain the API compatibility?
They said that they could add, we'll get to that in a sec. So it says that due to the number of factors, software projects that make use of OpenSSL can't simply migrate to the 1.1 API and drop support for the 1.0 API. In most cases, they'll need to continue to support both because there's a bunch of, operating systems that are still going to be using 1.0. Like the version shipped by default in almost every Linux and even FreeBSD is 1.0.
Sure.
Because 1.1 is only just being released now. He says it'd be if you switch everything to OpenSSL 1.1, then it would be unusable on almost every platform for the time being. Secondly, the OpenSSL 1.0.2 release is supported until December 31st of 2019. Whereas the OpenSSL 1.1.0 release is only supported until August of 2018. It's a .0 release, right? So that means that if you're, a long-term release style or whatever, you're going to want the one that's supported for longer, not the one that is going to end, in 18 months.
Well, I'm sure that, to be fair to them, I'm sure they'll come out with a 1.1.0.1 or 1.1.1 or something, which has a longer supported. And that's a minor.
Yes, but if you're in a long-term release style, you don't change the API at all. So you're stuck on 1.1.0.
That's assuming the update is just security. It's not a
but
API changes. But we'll see.
OpenSSL has not been great about that. 1.0.1 and 1.0.2 were not API compatible.
I'm an optimist, so I have to hope they'll do the right thing and then be proven wrong every time. But anyway.
So the platforms that have attempted to ship OpenSSL 1.1 are already encountering significant challenges. For example, Debian currently only has 257 packages out of 257 out of 518 that do not build against OpenSSL 1.1. He said there are also hidden gotchas with situations where different libraries are linked against different OpenSSL versions and are passing back and forth an OpenSSL data structure, which isn't the same anymore. What's interesting is many of those problems will be difficult to detect since they only fail at runtime, not at build time. Because, if you're trying to access the struct and you're defining the struct differently, you're going to get, the bits aren't going to be in the right place and it's going to be all kinds of explodey.
Yeah, that's more fun.
So yes, like you said,
love it when the package compiles properly and then seg faults or blows up spectacularly later on.
Yeah. So it says, we'll have to see what happens with LibreSSL. At the end of the email here, they say, you note that it's not a LibreSSL problem. If we added all the OpenSSL 1.1 accessors today, software written for OpenSSL 1.0 or 1.1 would work seamlessly with LibreSSL. However, software will still have to maintain compatibility with both the OpenSSL APIs anyway, so LibreSSL isn't really going to help save anybody any headache here. And I think even with adding the accessors, I'm not sure that everything that it would be possible to just make LibreSSL compatible with both APIs at the same time, because I think some of the structs change as part of growing the accessors and so on. I think for a lot of software projects, this might lead them towards deciding to switch to one of the newer clean APIs, like S2N, which is from Amazon, which is an API for doing TLS. And when you compile S2N, it uses OpenSSL or LibreSSL or WolfSSL or Boring SSL underneath to do the actual crypto. But the API of what the code you write in your program to access TLS is all through the S2N API, which can be stabilized, and then S2N can abstract away whatever either of the versions
acting as the shim / middleman, basically.
Or LibreSSL has libTLS, which is again a nicer, cleaner, more defined interface that's not going to change as often for doing SSL. So those, I think, will help. Switching to those will help a lot of applications. However, they don't provide the entirety of the functionality of OpenSSL. So for doing certain things, like if you're using the OpenSSL library to do, key signing or something, that's completely outside the libTLS API, which is mostly just the client and server for HTTPS and so on, or just SSL or TLS in general. Whereas OpenSSL is a library that does a lot more than just SSL.
Yeah, we do it and we use it internally here for some different things. So it's like, this is going to be an interesting challenge for a bunch of us who use OpenSSL in various ways.
And there's a Hacker News comment thread linked here as well that has a lot more conversation about it.
Nice. Okay, so we got our next story here. So this is one you wrote as well, Alan. It looks like, but Ted Ewingst has a new blog post. So tell us about what's going on with exfiltration.
Yes. So Ted did a little thought experiment here and is like, so could I send data out from a compromised server or out behind a firewall without actually sending any data? So there's a machine behind a firewall that I've somehow gotten access to, and there's data on it that I would like to get back to my machine, but I don't want to make an outbound connection that the firewall might see and log or block or whatever. So how do I, exfiltrate this data that I've compromised or captured out without having to send it?
Well, you just blink the power light using, right? Have something set up to monitor that, a webcam on another machine.
Yeah. So his way of doing this was with receive timing. So he's actually sending data from his machine to the compromised machine, which is in this case set up to receive data. But the app that he's running on that machine sleeps at certain intervals, depending on what the incoming data is, and or on the data it wants to send is, so that on the sending side, by looking at how quickly you're able to send the data to the other side or how fast they're receiving it, you can decode the secret message. So this is another similar way to create a back channel, but without transmitting anything, is to introduce delays in the receiver and measure the throughput as observed by the sender. All we need is a protocol with transmission control. Do we have one of those? I forget what it's called.
Right, there might be one of those floating around
transmission
somewhere.
Control protocol or something. That's what we would call it. It's easier or more reliable to code this using a plain pipe because then you don't have any network latency to muck up your measurements. But
Sure.
But the same principles apply to any network transmissions. So for here we see that we can see the little reader code, and it basically it has a data buffer, and it loops over that data buffer, and then based on the basically the ASCII code of each character of the data, it sleeps for some amount of time. So if the data in ASCII was the number 1, then it sleeps for 1 second, and if it was the number 9, it sleeps for 9 seconds, and so on.
Sure.
Then it moves the pointer 1 character, and then it reads data up to 32 kilobytes at a time from the socket. And it just keeps doing this and doesn't actually do anything with the data after it reads it. So for each digit we want to send back, we sleep a few seconds, then drain the pipe. We don't care about the data, although if this were a video file or an OS update, we would probably do something useful with it.
To make the deception really complete, right? Yeah. Cool.
So then on the writer side, we continuously fill the pipe with junk data, and then if or when we block, because the receiver side hasn't acknowledged enough data, calculate the difference between before and after. So you see in the writer code, it's in a loop for while 1 is 1. We calculate the time what it is now, so we call that before. Then we write the data, and then we calculate the time and call that after. So we know before we send any data, it was this time. We wrote the data, which will block if the receiver hasn't received the data, hasn't acknowledged the data yet. And then we record the time after. If the write didn't fail, if the write failed because the other side is hung up on us or whatever, we exit the loop so we don't loop forever. But then if the time after subtracted from the time before, so basically if we waited at all, if the two values don't, when you subtract them, aren't 0, then we print out the character.
Sure.
So then, yeah.
That's got to be really slow, though. Like, I'm sure you're not going for throughput on this.
Well, no, not on this one. But then, so you see that here's the main driver that just forks off and runs this. And we can see after we run it with input of certain a random number. And then on the other side, we can see it 1 character at a time with random delay between it, prints out those characters, and we've now downloaded all of the data. He says, in this simple example, the secret data, which is the arguments, are shared by the processes, but we can see that the writer isn't printing them from its own address space. It's figuring them out via the timing.
Sure.
So then he postulates, is it time to add random delays and buffering to firewalls to mess all this up? He's like, probably not. But it's an interesting thought experiment that shows just how many ways there are to covertly convey a message without actually obviously sending a message. In this case, it's just by
messages within the messages.
Yeah. In this case, it's the feedback to the other side of how long did it take us to read that.
Man, there's a lot of really paranoid stuff we're going to be talking about today. Like we're all trying to scare everyone for 2017. This is good. This is a fascinating thing, though. This, I wonder. You'd have to think like some militaries have used stuff like this or covert ops and whatnot.
Right, because if you figure if you do enough data, like an OS update is large, and you make the delays much smaller, so they're less noticeable, and you can take many of them and average it out, and you do some kind of like encoding like Wi-Fi does, where if you want to send 8 bytes of data, you actually transmit 12 or something, so that when it's hard to tell exactly what the delay on that one was, because maybe the packet was slightly more delayed because of the internet, you can average it out and figure out what the message actually was or something. Yeah, you could do quite a few things.
Someday, somebody in Hollywood will latch on to something like this, and it'll be part of some Bourne movie or something. Yes. Like, we got the data off the CIA mainframe by not sending it. Yeah, it'll be fun.
So in this particular case, it required the app running on the machine that's protected or whatever to be controlled by the malicious person. But depending how that is, that's not that hard.
Tom Cruise could figure it out, and I'm sure it involves ropes and pulleys and jumping off buildings. Sure. But anyway, coming soon to a theater near you, folks. Well, good stuff, Alan. Thanks. That's really a fascinating one, Ted. Now you're going to make us really paranoid. Good stuff. Okay, well, we got another story to get to here in a second, but first, our first sponsor this week, which we're going to be starting with DigitalOcean, and the website for that is DigitalOcean.com. You want to just go there. There's no slash or anything. Just go to DigitalOcean.com, create an account. Really easy to do. Take you like 30 seconds if you type pretty quick. So you're in good shape. The trick is after you create that account, though, and you go to your account settings, don't forget to use, there's a coupon code section. Put in free BSD Now. So it's not just BSD Now, it's free BSD Now, because that, for those who've been with us a while, they remember that was back when they had launched their free BSD support in the cloud. So it was a big deal, and they're still using that coupon code. Now, what's really cool is it's not just FreeBSD these days. So you can do Open, you can do Net, you can do Dragonfly. I mean, you can do all kinds of stuff. Or you can install FreeBSD and then install FreeBSD again if you want to use your own version that you'd like to load or change up how it's configured or whatever. Like, they provide access to everything. You got a great console. You got a full-fledged API, which lets you, programmatically do a lot of this.
Which was very handy when I needed to create 36 droplets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. You script it up once and then just execute in a loop. Done. But they have some really fantastic support. And, of course, data centers all over the world now. We've gone over the list on previous episodes. But if you're looking for something for Asia, for North America, Europe, I mean, they got you covered. So the nice thing is when you go to their site, they have a little tool which will let you test your connectivity to each of those centers as well. So you can test your latency and throughput, et cetera. So check that out when you're planning on your next cloud service you need to deploy. I know I use it for Quassel here, which is fantastic. And you can use it for things like mail server, backup. I mean, Alan, you have a status page, I believe you guys use for Scale Engine.
We have a status page for that. I use it for a personal server, like my backup MX server, for all my personal domains and all that stuff.
Yep, same here. So it's definitely good stuff, and they make it super cheap. So that the coupon code or access code, when you put it in there, it's going to give you a $10 credit, which is good for basically running 2 months of their lowest NVM, the $5 a month one, which is still backed by SSD, so don't let that fool you. But that's a great way to get started. It gives you plenty of time to kind of mess around with it, get it set up the way you want.
Especially if you use the hourly pricing, because then it only costs 0.7 of a cent per hour.
Which is perfect while you're in kind of that proof of concept or setup state, right? Maybe you've never done a MX backup and you're like, I don't know how to do that yet. So it gives you some time to mess around.
Or, if you just want to be like, I want to play with FreeBSD. I've never used it before, but I don't have enough RAM on my laptop or whatever to run a VM, or I'd like to have a fast internet connection while I was doing this. You can spin up the VM and then you could just delete it when you're done for the day after a couple of hours. and then it's only used up a couple of cents, and you have lots of credit left.
That's right. That's right. So they make it super easy. We recommend it, and we both use it for different things. So go check it out today, and hopefully you have as much luck with it as we have.
And you were mentioning the data centers. They had San Francisco, Toronto, New York, London, Amsterdam, Frankfurt, Bangalore, and Singapore. So that's pretty good coverage of the entire globe.
Yes, yes. Definitely you'll find one that'll work for you. Okay, so moving on in our news here. So we have OpenBSD Desktop in about 30 minutes. So actually, this is kind of interesting. You may just want to click on this one at some point. But over at Hacker News, we have a very non-verbose but handy guide to getting an OpenBSD Desktop in approximately 30 minutes-ish. So first of all, there's not a lot of description. It's just going to be a lot of commands they throw at you. But the guide does assume you've already installed OpenBSD 6.0. So you at least need to have that done, be it the shell prompt or your freshly installed system so you can get started with this. But with that, now it's basically just some tuning right up front. So they're going to be showing you how to edit a login.conf and set some new resource limits. It looks like they're upping some data size tunables to 2 gigabytes. So I'm sure that's useful for desktop computing. After that, then they switch over to changing some of the do as settings. So it's something a little bit more workable with desktop computing. So you can run as your user account. And then next up is another handy trick, which I'm sure people have already been doing for a long time, but editing your profile .profile file in your home directory to have your package path variable set so that package just works for you. And then one thing that some folks may overlook, and I appreciate they put this in here, but they show you how to disable A time on the disk. So editing FS tab and adding some flags to your mount options. So that
for people that don't know what that is, that's the last access time. So it means every time you read a file, your file system will write that, the last time this file was accessed has been updated. Most times you don't care about that. And so turning it off will save you all of those writes. And, when you're writing, your disk can't be reading. So it's taking away IOPS and bandwidth that could be used for reading.
We've shipped PCBSD and TrueOS for like 10 years with that off, just because it doesn't make sense in a desktop environment. Heck, a lot of servers ship with it off too.
So we even turn it off by on most data sets by default in FreeBSD, because especially when you're using ZFS with snapshots, it means that even if the file didn't change, every time you read it, that's a modification. And so now all your snapshots, even though no files have changed, are growing. And then especially if you take snapshots on a regular basis, it's like each of those snapshots is going to grow now, not just the one.
Just to record the access time. So unless you have a secure directory where you need to know when somebody last looked at a file, I mean, great, turn it on there, but probably don't want it across the board.
Sometimes depends on that to tell if there's new mail or whether you've read mail. So is the modified time newer than the access time? And if the access time never gets updated, then yes, that can be a problem for the you have new mail thing. And so that's why it's turned on for that one data set. But that's what is so nice about ZFS, is that you can turn it on for that one specific thing and off for everything else.
That's right. So anyway, this guide is going to show you what knobs you can tweak to do that in etcfs tab on OpenBSD for UFS, and that will help speed you up for sure. So do that on your desktops. Then after that, they're going to do some final typical WPA Wi-Fi configuration. We've covered that elsewhere, but you'll want to take a look here if you just need a quick reference on how to get connected to the internet on your laptop, for example. But after that, he says they drop to mere mortal mode and begin package installations. But in this particular guide, they're setting up the Lumina desktop environment, which for those who are like, wait, is that a TrueOS thing? Well, hey, guess what? It's on OpenBSD. It's on a lot of BSDs. So yes, that does work there. After that, a few small tweaks later for your Exinit RC file, things like X screensaver and I think a synaptic setting as well. Then you're ready to run StartX and pretty much begin your desktop session. I mean, if you follow this guide quickly, I think you could probably get this done in 10 minutes. It's not that bad, unless you have a slow internet connection. It takes forever to download packages. But anyway, this will result in a rock-solid OpenBSD desktop rocking Lumina desktop, which would be pretty nice. So you're able to have a lightweight, slim desktop, still pretty full-featured without all the dbus and other weird dependencies that you probably don't want to suck into your system without really needing them. So definitely good stuff. Check it out if you've been meaning to set up a new OpenBSD desktop or laptop in the new year. Definitely give this guide a bookmark here and reference that when you're setting it up. Okay, and for our next story, which kind of inspired the title of this week's episode, How Dtrace Saved Christmas, which that's pretty cool. Yes. So you have to tell us what Adam's working on here now, and how did Dtrace save his Christmas?
So Adam Leventhal, who is one of the original co-creators of Dtrace, wrote up his post over the holidays of how he used Dtrace at home to save Christmas. So he says, I was procrastinating making the family holiday card. It was a combination of having lots on my plate and dreading the formulation of our annual note recapping the year. There were some great moments, but I'm glad I don't have to do 2016 over again. It was just before midnight, and either I make the card that night or leave an empty space on our friends' refrigerators. But Adobe Illustrator had other ideas. So he's on his Mac, and he tries to fire up Adobe Illustrator, and it says, unable to set maximum number of files to be opened. And then I guess it exits after that error. He says, I was not the first person to hit this. The problem seems to have existed since Adobe Suite CS6 was released in 2016. None of the solutions that he found online were working for him. And inspired by someone else's excellent post, I was rapidly running out of time for this project. You know, if I didn't get it done in an hour, then I was going to have to give up and not do a Christmas
game
card,
over.
Right? So he says, enough, I'll just detrace it. So a colleague scoffed at the other day, and he was like, I mean, how often do you actually use Dtrace? In his mind, Dtrace was for big systems and critical infrastructure when dollars and lives were at stake. My reply was, I use Dtrace every day. I can't imagine developing software without Dtrace. I even use it on my laptop, not infrequently, especially when it does something inexplicable. I am forever grateful to the Apple team for porting Dtrace to Mac OS X. So he says, first I want to make sure to get the name of the Illustrator process because, you know, on a Mac, the process names are supposed to be all nice and shiny, right? So he fires up Dtrace and looks for any system calls being done and group them by the name of the executable. And he sees, you know, Watchdog D, AWDD, and then Google Chrome and Google Chrome Hell, and where the rest of helper is cut off, and Adobe Illustrator, because that's the character count limit or whatever, so there's no R on Illustrator. So he says, glad I'm checked, because it's Adobe Illustrator.
Well, you know.
Now that we were pretty sure that Illustrator is failing on the set R limit, which sets the resource limit of how many files you can open, and that it blows up as a result, let's confirm that's in fact what's happening. So he runs Dtrace and looks for the system call set R limit and getting the return value only if the executable is Adobe Illustrator, in which case print out the return value and the error no. So then he detraces and fires up Illustrator, and you see, the attempt to call set R limit and gets a return value of -1, meaning an error, and the error message is 1. So an error message of 1 is permission denied, which normally indicates that the value you're trying to set is too high to be set by the non-root user. So only root can ask for more than so many thousand open files.
Sure, like the max file limit's not tuned up high enough or something.
So he says, I already tuned up the file limit pretty high. So let's confirm that it is in fact setting the file limit and checking the value to which it's being set. So another little Dtrace script, after reading the set R limit man page, to figure out that, you know, which argument is the one he wants, and finds out that it's a struct R limit, and he has to copy that in to the kernel from userland with the copy and subroutine. But he writes this little Dtrace script, which is find all calls going into set R limit where the executable name is Adobe Illustrator, and then extract the R limit struct and print out the value. The parameter that's being set, the current limit, and the maximum limit. And we see that Adobe Illustrator is trying to set a limit of 2,800 with a hard max of 7 FFF, like the huge value. So like I think, so the 2,800 is actually in hex. So that's not 2,800, that's more. I'm bad at doing that hex math in my head.
All right. Not on the fly.
Oops. So that's 10,240. So it's trying to do 1024 times 10 files. And apparently that's too many. Or it's trying to set the limit to 2 to the power of 63 minus 1, which is an awfully large value and maybe is more than the maximum what it should be. So he said the quickest solution was to use Dtrace again to whack a smaller number into the struct. So he fires up Dtrace in what's called destructive mode. with the -w flag, where you can actually, as part of inspecting what's going on, change things.
Make changes. Yep.
So basically,
on the fly.
Yeah. So basically, it says after we copy in, or when someone tries to call set our limit and their executable name is Adobe Illustrator, make a new our limit t variable and set the limit is trying to set to 10,000 instead of 2 to the power of 63.
Sure.
And then copy that out to the kernel. So then now when Adobe tries to set it, Dtrace will actually set it to a smaller, it will change the input parameters to a smaller number so that maybe Illustrator will start. But sadly, he was foiled. Dtrace could not enable tracing, permission denied. He's like, oh, right. Thanks to the System Integrity Protection Service on a Mac, it was blocked. So this is a new laptop, at least a new motherboard due to some bizarre issue, which probably contributed to Illustrator not working as it once did. Because it's new and I hadn't yet disabled this particular part of the system integrity protection that prevents Dtrace on the kernel or in destructive mode, it's easy enough to disable, but you have to reboot to do it, and he doesn't want to reboot right now, right? He's trying to...
Sure.
I hate having to restart my terminals. So plan B, I'm going to use LLDB, which is the Clang debugger, basically.
Yep.
So first I used Dtrace to find the code that was calling set our limit. So using his knowledge of the x86 ISA and ABI, he found the pointer to the thing that's actually calling set our limit. So now he went over to LLDB and basically started Illustrator through LLDB and told it to break on the init function. And then once it did, he set up something so that when it returns to the function from the set our limit call, he then uses memory write to overwrite the actual return value with a different one. So he's going to trick Illustrator into thinking that the set our limit worked fine.
That it returned correctly.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So he does that, and then he runs his code and then does a process detach and goes on with making his holiday card.
I think he wins an award for the most effort put into making a holiday card ever. Yep. or fixing Illustrator on the fly.
Yeah.
Holy crap.
But it's a good illustration of using Dtrace and how it would have worked, except for he was on a Mac, and so he used LLDB.
Oh, that's really good, Adam. And if you find other things like that, post about it. That's interesting.
I would have just patched the Adobe binary, but the way binaries are done on OS X with the Mach-O thing is he always forgets how it works, so he didn't bother with that one.
Yeah, that's probably more of a pain, right?
Yeah.
Use what you know.
But he says here, Dtrace was designed to solve hard problems on critical systems, but the need to understand how systems behave exists in development and on consumer systems. Just because you didn't write a program doesn't mean you can't fix it.
That is true. That is true. Now, did you submit a patch upstream and let Adobe Illustrator folks know about this?
Yeah. So I think the problem is that it's just setting a value too high. I don't know if it's actually... I don't know which of the two parameters it's tripping over. If it's actually setting the number of files to 1024.0 is the problem, or if it's the actual hard limit that it's trying to set that's the problem. Because generally, you would want to get the number and then update that struct with a newer curd level, but not change the hard max, because as a user, you're only allowed to lower the hard max, not raise it. So pay
attention here, users. This is how you submit a good bug report. Because if that came into the bug tracker, it's like, oh, great, he did all the work and figured it out. Like, we'll just patch that.
Yeah, it's just all you have to do is make sure we don't call set our limit with a stupidly huge value.
Oh, yeah, easy. Well, very good. Okay, we're heading into the news roundup, and we have a little treat to get us started here. So Brian Everly over at the Functionally Paranoid blog has a little treat for us today. So first of all, let's give you a moment. Go ahead and get your tinfoil hats on. Okay, you all set? Good. Well, let's go ahead and begin now. So he's looking at 2017 and, refocusing on what we should be paranoid about. And he's going to cover a bunch of different topics, but we'll kind of just go through them all. We're going to hit all the highlights because it's a pretty long article. Definitely well worth your time. But he starts off with a look at physical security for your system. So he begins by listing your options. So first up is BIOS passwords. He said, this is something I'm not typically impressed with. He said, most can be avoided by opening up the machine, closing a jumper, powering it up to reset the NVRAM to factory defaults. He's like, I don't even bother with them. That's true. I haven't touched those in a decade or more.
Yeah, I haven't really seen them used often until I rented a machine from IBM, and they charge extra to enable certain BIOS options, so they password protect the BIOS.
Oh, okay.
I'm like, that's just evil. You want to charge me $7 a month to enable the VTD instructions?
Or to turn on an extra serial port or something. That's nice.
Yeah, I'm just like, you bastards.
Yeah, that's pretty horrible. Okay, so
and the machine's in Singapore, so I can't just pull the battery.
Sure. Yeah, the remote hands on that may suck. But next up, he says, is full disk encryption. He said, this one really rings my bell in a positive way. If you can kill power to the box, either because of a bad actor has had to physically steal it and they aren't carrying around a pile of car batteries and an inverter, or because you can interrupt power to it in some other way, then the disk is, of course, encrypted. The other beauty of this is that if a drive fails, which, of course, they all do eventually, you don't have to have any privacy concerns about chucking it into an electronics recycler, or if you're a bad person into a landfill. Hey, that's the easy way. Well, yeah, sometimes we have an electronics recycler here, but it's a pain to get to.
Yep.
Anyway.
Well, the bigger one here is if the drive's still under warranty and you send it back to the manufacturer to get the free replacement. It's like you have to send it to them if you want the free replacement.
That's true.
But
you can't put a shotgun shell through it first or something. So like, there's your problem.
Yes. So for that one, that's why full disk encryption is often very useful on NASs and servers, even though generally you don't really want to do it that way, even if it's on a server, the key lives on a USB stick and you don't even set it up to require you to type in a password. It just boots automatically. It's just so that the data on the disk is scrambled. So when you have to RMA them, you don't have to worry about your customer's data that you may have some legal obligation to protect is in plain text on this disk that's going out to the drive manufacturer.
That's correct. So as he said, of course, the data is effectively gibberish without the key. So it would take a long time for somebody to brute force it. So that's definitely +1 there. He said his third thing for physical security is two-factor auth for logins. He said, I like this one as well. I'm not a fan of biometrics because if your fingerprint is compromised, he says, yes, it can happen. Read about the Department of Defense background checks that were extracted by a bad agent, including the fingerprint images, and you can't exactly send off for a new finger. Speaking of that, we had a talk at Knoxbug a few months back where that came up on once you lose your fingerprints, how do you change them? Right? That's kind of a big deal.
Yeah, he said things like the problems.
Right? He said things like the YubiKey are pretty slick, though. He said they require that you have physical hardware key as well as the password. So unless the bad actor lifted your physical key, they would have a much harder time with physical access to your hardware. So he mentions out of those options, he currently uses both disk encryption and the YubiKey for all his secure network systems. He said next up is network segmentation. In this case, he mentions the very first thing to do is change your admin password for any ISP-supplied modem or router. He then goes on to scare us. I didn't thought about this before. It goes on to scare us about JavaScript attacks being used not against your local machine. Oh no, but instead they could be trying to hack into the non-WAN exposed router admin interface. So you go to say a malicious website and it's not even attacking your machine. Oh no. It's trying to access your D-Link. That's not available on the WAN side, but because they're running JavaScript on your machine, they can log in.
It doesn't even necessarily require JavaScript. I've seen this done with iframes even. There are some routers that don't have the cross-site request forgery stuff set up. So if you just deep link to a specific URL and use HTTP URL parameters, you could change the DNS server on somebody's router to be yours and then man-in-middle them. And I've seen this also done with images embedded in an email sent to somebody's iPhone. And their iPhone's on the Wi-Fi. And almost everybody's Wi-Fi, the router has one of like 8 IP addresses, right?
Of course.
And so they just embedded 8 little images. They're all 1 pixel by 1 pixel, so you don't even see them in the email. But the iPhone email app is opening them automatically. And doop, you open this email on your iPhone, and your router has been reprogrammed.
That is, again, tinfoil hats on here. This is some very paranoid, crazy stuff, but it can happen.
Change those passwords.
Change
if your ISP is
yes.
good, it'll be set to a random password that's printed on a sticker on the bottom of your modem. Although most of those are generated based on like MAC address or a couple other things.
Yeah.
So it means that if somebody knows the script the manufacturer used to do this, they can also come up with that password. So even that one's not good enough. At least it's not.
They're not really hard to brute force because I've seen some where it's like a 4-character password too, which is kind of like. Oh.
But the ones where it's just admitted bin and you could just put it in the URL and then use JavaScript or an iframe or an image link. Owned.
Yeah. So for added security, naturally, he also firewalls the router that he got from his ISP by plugging the LAN port into an OpenBSD box, which then does the second layer of true firewall and router protection, which that's a good tip. I do that with my FreeBSD box at the house. But he says, what about privacy and browsing? Well, he has some more tips for us there. He says, I use Unbound as my DNS resolver on my local network with all UDP port 53 traffic redirected to it by PF, so I don't have to configure anything on the clients. That's good. He said, then he forwards all the traffic to a DNS script proxy, caching the results in Unbound. He said, I noticed zero performance penalty for this, and it greatly enhances privacy. He said, this combination of Unbound and DNS script proxy works very well together. You can even have redundancy by having multiple upstream resolvers running on different ports, basically running the DNS script proxy daemon multiple times, pointing to different resolvers. And then he also gives us a little aside. He said, I also use Firefox exclusively for my web browsing. He said, by leveraging the tips on this page, and he has a link here, he said, you can lock it down to do a great job of privacy protection. And this is one I hadn't thought of before, but he said, the fact that your laptop battery drain rate can now be used as a fingerprint in your browser completely trips me out. But he said, hey, that's the world we live in.
Yeah. So they added this API so that specifically on your phone, on your laptop, the website could decide to go easier on you because you're running out of battery. It's like,
too much information. You don't need that.
Yeah.
But anyway, apparently they can use that for a fingerprinting use. So a little scary there. But he said, what about the cloud, you may ask? Well, Brian has a nice solution for that as well. He said, I recently decided I'd try to live in a cloud-free life. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a synopsis on what I did. He said, I discovered a wonderful open source project called FreeNAS. What this little gem does is... I know, right? What is this little thing? Wow, we should let you know what this is. He says, what this little gem does is allow you to install FreeBSD ZFS file server appliance on AMD 64 hardware and have a slick web interface for managing it. He said, I picked up a nice Supermicro motherboard and chassis with a 4 hot swap drive bay and 2 internal bays that I used to mirror the boot volume on, and I am rocking the ZFS lifestyle. And he says, thanks, Alan Jude.
You spelled my name wrong every time.
Oh, well.
It's okay.
Well, we get this out of it. Yeah. But he says that one of the nicest features FreeNAS has is that it also provides the ability to leverage the FreeBSD jail functionality in an easy-to-use way. It also has plugin, but the security on those is a bit sketchy because he talks about old versions of the library, etc. So he decided to roll his own. So he created 2 jails, one to run OwnCloud, and he said, yes, he knows about Nextcloud. He might switch at some point. And the other to run a full SMTP IMAP email server stack. He said, I use Let's Encrypt to generate the SSL certs and make sure I hit on A on SSL labs before I did anything else. Okay, good deal. He then goes back and talks a little bit about backups and Internet of Things devices, something else you need to consider in this truly paranoid world we're forced to live in. But we even get a nice shout out at the end, so we have to mention that. He says, enter Tarsnap, the company that advertises itself as online backups for the truly paranoid. It brings a tear to my eye, a kindred spirit. Thanks again to Alan Jude, misspelled again, and Chris Moore, spelled right, thank you, from the BSD Now podcast for turning me on to this company. It was a very easy command syntax. He says, yes, it isn't a GUI tool. Suck it up, Buttercup. You wanted to learn the shell, didn't you? And it even allows you to compile the thing from source if you want to. So I think that checked all of his truly paranoid boxes there. That's good stuff. But actually, I've only covered some of the highlights here. It's a pretty long article, and there's a lot more in it. You should really take a few moments of your time today to read this from top to bottom. There's a lot of good tips here, even if you're not going to go quite to the extremes he does. There's just some good information here. So if you're thinking about redoing some of the security at your house or office or whatever, give this one a read first. You may come out a little wiser. So when you go do the setup, you're a little smarter and can implement it better. Okay, well, that was a lot of fun. So take us on to our next one, Alan, here. It looks like we got an open source book. What's going on?
Yeah, so based on a Kickstarter campaign from a couple years ago, Carl Fogel, formerly of the Open Source Initiative, I think, forget which one now, has created an open source book called Producing Open Source Software. And it's how to run a successful free software project. And it's currently 9 chapters and over 200 pages in the PDF form, plus a bunch of appendices. But it covers all kinds of different topics, including how to choose a good name for your open source project. I've seen a couple too many projects with names that are impossible to Google. One that...
Or spell, right?
Things you can't spell or can't pronounce are especially difficult. But I remember when there was was it carbon? Graphite, for graphite. That's a kind of cool name, but when you Google for graphite, you mostly find golf clubs.
That's true.
And now once the project matured a bit, maybe with the right other keywords mixed in, you could find it, but it was difficult sometimes. And all the other gotchas about names, including, making sure it's something that you can actually own on important namespaces, right? If the Twitter account for it's already taken, maybe it's not such a good idea anymore, right? Making sure you have version control. This one's a lot easier nowadays. Almost everybody does. But if you don't have some good version control, your project is going to have all kinds of a mess. Having a bug tracker, how to create developer guidelines to make sure that everybody's following the same setup, how to set up your communication channels, whether that's mailing lists or IRC or Slack or whatever. Choosing a license, although their version kind of really leans towards the GPL, but,
We would say go the other way with that. But anyway.
But setting the tone of the project, nipping rudeness in the bud, how to practice conspicuous code review and how to, avoid the common things that go wrong and so on.
I was very tempted to switch our license to DBAD. Have you heard of that one? The Don't Be a Dick license. It's basically a BSD license, except it just says "Don't be a dick" when you're copying, and it kind of sets the tone, right? But anyway, you should look that up.
Yes, but a proper BSD license, I think, is more professional in this case. But anyway.
Oh, okay. Anyway,
it even has advice on joining or creating nonprofit organizations, the economics of open source, how to deal with money, and so on. But also release engineering, packaging, nightly builds, snapshots, all that kind of stuff. How to deal with forks and other stuff. Where to get hosting, how to do version control, whether you should set up IRC, whatever, social and political infrastructure, whether you want to have, the benevolent dictator model or the consensus-based democracy model, and that kind of thing, how to make sure to write those things down, participating with businesses and government agencies and so on. So like some of this even has advice is if you're a company or a government agency and you want to be help an open source project because you use it, here's some tips for it. Communications, you are what you write, how to structure stuff, how to recognize rudeness, avoid these common pitfalls, don't post without a purpose, lots of other things. Like I said, packaging, releasing, so on. Managing participants, community and motivation and delegation and criticism and how to deal with all that. Committers, choosing committers, how to deal with people who you have to revoke access for, how to have partial access, what to do about dormant committers, and how to avoid mystery and all this other stuff. And dealing with giving out credit. You want to credit every person who's helped even a little bit, but eventually that list gets hard to manage. But then getting into legal matters like licenses, copyrights, trademarks, patents, and other things you might run into. And it's got some appendixes that are obsolete now, like, what different free version control systems are there, what free bug trackers are there, why should I care what color the bike shed is?
Of course.
And even example instructions for reporting bugs, which I think is a good section. But they even have some interesting... trademark case studies, like the case study of Firefox versus the Debian project and, what an ice weasel is. And the GNOME logo and the fish pedicure shop, which is an interesting legal case that happened where somebody took basically the GNOME logo, added an extra toe, and made the foot in the shape of a fish. So it looked very, very much like the GNOME logo, but it was also a fish eating the dead skin off your foot, which was what this business did.
I wonder if they could put in there the whole FreeBSD daemon getting used on the Mexican candy or
the condom dispensing machines in airports and all kinds of different places that BSD has showed up.
Oh, this sounds like a really complete ebook.
Yeah,
This is a
like I
pretty
said, in the
slick.
PDF version that's actually formatted as an ebook, it's over 200 pages of content, not counting all the appendices.
Yeah, it looks like it's under a good license too. It's under the Creative Commons license.
Creative
so.
Commons attribution share alike. So just as long as
Okay.
you leave the other guy's name on it and make any derivative also under this license, then you should be good to go.
Definitely check it out. Okay, well, it's time for our second sponsor this week, which we kind of got a little shout out for them in the FreeNAS segment earlier, where we were talking about how Brian's using that to do his jails and storage at the house. But iXsystems is the company behind a lot of that. So iXsystems.com/BSD Now is, of course, the URL you'll want to use. You go there. There's a teeny little form you fill out, name, email address, contact info, that kind of stuff. And then you'll be put in touch with one of the sales engineers over there who can help you design whatever it is you need to do. So we're talking big systems if you need a full IX rack of gear. Basically, think of it as your cloud in a single rack, right? You can have storage, compute, everything. And we've talked about a lot of the different solutions they have, all the way up to something big like that, down to the little FreeNAS Mini that maybe you could use at your house.
4 drives,
small
you
home
need 8
office.
drives, you need 12 drives, 24, 36, 100.
They can give you all the options to do that. And of course, TrueNAS, which would be the big brother version of FreeNAS in this case, is interesting too. Some folks may want to take a look at that because it basically takes FreeNAS and makes it HA, which is kind of cool. You end up with one unit with 2 heads in it, and you can fail over between the two.
So you have 2 little machines that are each a head so that you can upgrade one while the other one does all the work so that you can upgrade without ever having any downtime. Or, if one of them crashes or power supplies die or whatever.
Sure.
But they just connect to shelves of disks. So you don't run out of room in the chassis. You just add shelves. And it's like, all right, well, this shelf's got 24 disks. And let's add a second one and a third one. And you just keep adding disks as you go. And you don't have to upgrade the TrueNAS. Although eventually you might want more RAM for it. But
sure. Yeah, maybe you're doing something computer or CPU intensive or whatever. But yeah, they provide that and all kinds of different variations of that, all flash, mixed flash, etc. And of course, all powered by the latest and greatest Intel processors. So definitely get in touch with them today. The cool thing about IX, which we've talked about a lot in the previous years, is their sales engineers know their stuff. So don't just call up and say, I want this model of that. Call up and say, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm going to be doing NFS. I'm going to be doing AFP. Maybe I'm going to be doing AFP plus Samba on the same shares, and I need to know how we can make that work. There's all kinds of stuff you want to tell them.
This many files that are on average this size, or I want to do video editing on it. It's a lot different than I want to serve a million tiny CAD files.
That's right. So, of course, they'll put together a package which is properly tuned to make sure it meets minimum performance guarantees and will do exactly what you want. So don't be afraid to get into the nitty-gritty when you call them. If you're doing mail server, tell them. If you're running a database, tell them what kind of database, what kind of size you're going to be doing, etc. Like they need all that info so
impacts what kind of SSDs you want. And you probably wouldn't think of that.
So that's the IX experience you don't get elsewhere. So if you're looking for something new in 2017, definitely give them a call. And when you talk to them, tell them you heard about it here on BSD Now, because they love to hear from our listeners. And I've heard a lot of success stories. Every time I go in, they're like, wow, we talked to a lot of your listeners and those guys are fantastic. They know their stuff. So they know they're dealing with a certain class individual when you call up and say, yeah, I'm a BSD Now guy. So definitely mention that.
But they also build custom things. Somebody recently was trying to build a machine they could overclock for their supercomputing needs. And so they needed water cooling. That's not something you normally get in a server.
Yeah, that's true. That is true.
IX can build anything. And so here's an image of their water-cooled setup. You can see the block is there on the CPU, and it runs the water back into the radiator that they have connected against the bank of hot swappable fans in this case. And then, once the water's cooled off again, it goes back over the CPU.
That's pretty slick. Yeah, I mean, they love challenges like that. We've highlighted some of them over the years. They've done some crazy stuff. So if you have crazy, let them know because they can do crazy.
So they
as well, which is
took an i7 Haswell CPU with 8 cores and managed to overclock it from the stock 3.0 gigahertz to 4.8 gigahertz.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And they said based on their tests, if they had gone with a 3U tall case where they could fit more, bigger radiator and so on, they probably could have gotten even more out of that CPU.
That is really cool. That's really
the chassis runs 920 watt redundant high efficiency platinum power supply, so that's like 95% efficient. So the power supply basically puts out cold air instead of warm air. None of the power is getting wasted.
It's actually cooling your machine.
Yeah, and it's got 16 2.5-inch drive bays, so you can fit up to 80 terabytes of space in it.
Yeah, that's definitely really slick. So, next time you order, if your system's going to be one of those, let us know because we like to talk about it on the show. And we make people jealous. Like, oh, I want one of those. And then the drool factor kicks in. It's good stuff.
Very fancy.
Okay, well, it's time to go to our next story here, Alan. So we got some Dtrace flame graphs. Well, this is the week of Dtrace. We got some good stuff. So what's going on? Dtrace plus Node plus FreeBSD.
Can you tell that I've been using Dtrace and flame graphs over the... over the holidays while I was doing my research for Asia BSDCon?
I guess so.
But
speaking of which, did you get that turned in?
Luckily, the deadline got extended to the 13th. So.
I saw. It did. So it was a little more time. Sorry,
I'm going to make fancier graphs this way. But anyway, so this is basically a short tutorial on how to use Dtrace flame graphs with Node.js on FreeBSD. So recently, BSD Unixes have been acknowledged by the application development community as an interesting operating system to deploy on. This is not surprising, given that FreeBSD has had Jails, the original container system, for 17 years, and lots of network-focused businesses like Netflix see it as the best way to deliver content. This developer interest has led to hosting companies providing FreeBSD, whether that's Amazon, Microsoft Azure, Joyance Cloud, or even DigitalOcean. Dtrace is a vital feature that anyone who's ever dealt with production issues has been available in FreeBSD since version 9. As of 11, the operating system now contains some great work by Fedor so that you can profile Node applications and create flame graphs in Node.js processes with any additional runtime flags or restarting a process. So if you've not seen a flame graph, this is what one looks like here. So basically, at the very bottom, you can see the red bar that goes all the way across is node start, and then node main and node start, and so on.
Sure.
So basically, what the flame graph is showing is each function and how much time it spent on the CPU. So in this case, the initial main function was responsible for everything, and then it called node start, which called UV run, which called EV run, on and on. But then once you get up to this function here, you can see that it spent some of its time running this, some of its time calling out to node server IO, and then node stream IO. And that's where most of the work happened. And then you see the stream IO function either calls read or write. And you can see that it shows the breakdown that you did a lot more reading than writing in this case. And then you can see, on read and make callback, and then, it breaks down which parts of the functions were actually doing all of the work, or in this case, taking all of the time. It may not be that they're doing the most work, it's just they're taking the most time, which can be what you're trying to figure out, which is where is this program spending all of its time? And we see that it spends most of its time on, parser on incoming in http.js. So it spends most of its time running as an HTTP server. So if you want,
especially if you're a developer, being able to optimize based on these graphs.
In my case, I did Dtrace against the SSH server and was looking at how much time it was spending doing encryption versus actually transferring files. And then as I made my tweaks, cutting it down so that it's spending most of its time copying data back and forth and not wasting time doing anything else. And that's how I managed to get it to do 14 gigabits per second.
Wow, nice. How's that non-cipher?
Well, the non-cipher, but the problem with the non-cipher is it still does a MAC, a message authentication code. And even with the 3.5 gigahertz CPU, that tops out at about 6 gigabits. So I created a new non-MAC option. And then basically Dtrace allowed me to prove that at that point, all my time was spent in libc doing like memcopy and memset. So it's basically, at this point, it's almost as fast as Netcat. Like Netcat does maybe 16 gigabits.
Sure. So you have patches incoming to like the OpenSSH portable or something for us?
They're currently based
consumers?
on the HPN branch of the OpenSSH portable, yes. All my work so far is up on GitHub, but wait for the paper. It'll have fancy graphs. It'll only be another week before all that's ready to go because it has to be in by the deadline for Asia BSDCon.
Yeah.
Anyway, if you want to know more about flame graphs, Brendan Gregg has a great deep dive over. He did a an article for ACMQ, the magazine for programmers, and it has some entertaining historical context of where it came from and how they work. But anyway, you can check that out. So now that you know what a flame graph is and why you might want to use it, how do you do it for Node.js on FreeBSD? It's quite simple. First, you probably want Dtrace to start an OS start. In particular, you can't load Dtrace from inside a jail. So you probably want to load it on the host automatically so that it's available in the jail without you having to go to the host and load it manually. So in your bootloader.conf or loader.conf.local, add the line dtrace all _ load equals yes, and that will load all the Dtrace modules and you'll be good to go. Next, if you're dealing with Node.js and you can get pretty complicated programs and really tall stacks, you might want to increase the size of the kern.dtrace.helper actions max so that you can have object files greater than 128 kilobytes or something. Setting that sysctl in your etc sysctl.conf. And then it's just a matter of installing Node, which depends on Git, GCC, and Python. In this case, they compiled Node from ports because they want to enable the dtrace build time option, which is a patch. I think it's an upstream node now, but anyway, an optional build option that builds with all the dtrace probes set up in Node.js. So then, in this case, then you can install, npm or whatever, and install your Node app that you're going to use. And you probably also want the source code for FreeBSD, so it shows you how to add that after the fact. They also use a tool called StackViz, and there's some outstanding pull requests to enable support for flame graphs. So until that's done, it shows you how to manually pull that off GitHub instead of getting it from NPM. But once that's merged, you won't have to do that. And then at that point, you can follow the generic flame graph tutorial that's actually on the official Node.js website.
Oh, okay. This doesn't look that bad.
So it's just setting up. And so you can see here at a frequency of 97 hertz or 97 times a second, if the exec name is Node, then all we do is get the stack trace and how many times each one's been done. And then we basically run for 60 seconds. Once that's done, we'll have this stack.out file that'll have every function we measured as running. Every 97 times a second, we check what function's running, and then we keep track of how many times each one was run. Then we measure that for 60 seconds, and we create this file, and this file now tells us, this function was running, 87 of those times, and this one was running 1,000 of those times or whatever. And then StackViz, dtrace flame graph, and it will just take in that stack.out file and throw out an SVG, and then there you have all the data. And because it's an SVG or scalable vector graphic, it's actually an XML-ish file that draws a picture. So it means that you can actually hover over function names and see more details.
Get like labels.
So even when the function, when the bar is really small and you can't actually read the name, you can hover over it and get the detail.
So I want this for like every language, right?
Yep.
We need a Python version, we need a C version, a PHP version.
Dtrace does this in C by default already.
Okay. But I mean, like all the hooks to do like the flame graphs and stuff, to have an article that's kind of like, here's your language and here's how you set it up using these.
Yeah, it's on Brendan Gregg's website. Pretty slick. It's on Brendan Gregg's website. I used exactly that to do the ones for SSH, because for SSH I didn't have to do anything. I just ran dtrace with capture the every 97 second or 97 times a second, measure what function is being called, and then run the command sshd, and then that generates the .out file, and then there's a Perl script that reformats that into the right output, and then his second Perl script makes the SVG file, and then I open it in my browser, and there's the data.
Then you're done. That is really slick. That is cool. Yeah, I'd like to see more and more people doing this.
I think building
there's so many performance things people could be doing with this to do analysis.
So I know Node.js has this support. I think PHP might. I think Postgres does. So it'll be interesting to see more userland apps getting the extra bits for this.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. Okay. Anything else you want to add on that before I move on here?
Remember Brendan Gregg's ACM article that explains the history of flame graphs. This is called The Flame Graph. This visualization of software execution is a new necessity for performance profiling and debugging.
Okay. Yeah, check it out. We get the links in the show notes. So if you're driving, when you get to where you're going, take a look.
Yeah, but I guess the one thing I want to mention is that we kind of glossed over the point earlier. It was saying one of the cool things about Dtrace is that you don't have to restart the application. Like normally, most applications have some form of debugging functionality, but it requires you to turn the application off and start it again with debugging enabled.
Mangle the flags.
Or some of them even require you to recompile it with the debugging enabled. But with Dtrace, you can just attach to an already running application. What's important with this is sometimes the bad behavior doesn't happen until the program's been running for a week. Well, you don't want to have it
hits a certain point.
You can't run it in debugging mode for a week and hope that it happens again. Or it could be, it's under really heavy load. And it's like, well, if it's only under really heavy load, I don't really want to restart the server in the middle of that. So Dtrace is designed to allow you to observe it, hopefully with a minimal performance impact so that it's not actually going to slow it down too much. But the fact that you can just attach to a running application while it's under load and see the problem actively happening, whereas most other debugging, it's just not really possible to do that.
Yeah, being able to sample this data on the fly.
Yeah, and that's the other thing is
really cool.
sampling is, you can decide to just check 10 times a second and see what's going on there rather than having to, say, get the output of every single function call. It's like you can get overwhelmed with the debugging, whereas you just need a sample.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Okay, so we're going to move on here. So our last news roundup item we have is SSHGuard 2.0 call for testing. So tell us about this, Alan. This looks exciting. I need to switch.
SSHGuard is a tool for monitoring brute force attacks and blocking them. The original version of it, 1.0, instead of reading log files like most other things like fail2ban do, you actually set it up in your syslog.conf as a pipe. So syslog actually starts SSHGuard and writes the data directly into the pipe of SSHGuard. And the original version had no configuration at all. It was just, you could have command line flags to say, this is how frequently I want to block people and for how long or whatever, but it just did it. They've broken it up a little bit to make it a bit easier, but also to be able to sandbox it. So SSHGuard got a lot of work, and it says it now works with new log sources, including journalctl for systemd and Mac OS X logs, but those aren't very much interest to us. But it also gained new firewalls like IPset and firewalld. But the big thing is that it now has a configuration file. And most importantly, SSHGuard has been split into several processes that are piped into each other. So there's SSHG logmon, which is the thing that will have syslog piped into it. Then there's SSHG parser, which separate from the program that gets run as root by syslog. The SSHG parser is the thing that actually looks at the strings of data coming in and decides what to do with them, or which one's an attack. And then it tells SSHG blocker, hey, you should deal with this. And so the blocker then keeps the whitelist and the blacklist. And so it knows who not to block, because, sometimes I fat finger my password and I don't want to get me blocked. And certain people that are already blocked. And then it talks to SSHG FW, which is a wrapper that talks to whether it's, if you're using PF, IPFW, IP filter, or, firewalld, and deals with that. What's interesting here is that SSHG parser, the one that's vulnerable to the most problems because it's doing string manipulation, can run in a capsicum or pledge sandbox.
Okay.
So because it doesn't, it's not the part that's talking to syslogd, and it's not the part that actually is issuing firewall commands. It's just reading text in and writing text out. You can lock it down with a sandbox very, very tightly. And I really like the new flow of the program of keeping that parsing engine that is the most likely to have a buffer overflow or memory flaw or whatever as a separate process that can be really, really tightly locked down. So the SSHG blocker can also be sandboxed in its default configuration if you don't want it to have a PID file or a whitelist or a blacklist. Right? If it doesn't need to open any files, you can lock it down just as tightly. Although with Capsicum, you could easily make it so it could read from the whitelist and write to the blacklist and not do anything else. So maybe the extra patches for that could even go further ahead. But yeah, being able to lock down those two middle parts of the pipeline whilst not having to worry about locking down every privilege that would cause problems with the logmon part could really be quite interesting.
Yeah, that is very nice.
So breaking up the process to keep the sensitive bits in sandboxes is really nice. It's nice to see something in the port tree actually adopting Capsicum this way.
Speaking of port tree, I'm just looking to see if it's been updated.
This isn't out yet. It's available
it's not out
on
yet.
their SourceForge repo as SSHGuard 1.99.0. They want to test it a bit more before they release 2.0. So this is your chance to test it. In particular, they would love people that are package maintainers and people with suitable test environments to give the new code a shot and give the feedback before they go and do the release.
So this is a coming soon thing. So give it a whirl, give them feedback so that me and Alan can use this now.
Yes.
This looks awesome. Definitely liking it. Okay. Okay, so we got a couple beastie bits to pass along before we get into our feedback and questions. So we'll get started at the top here. We got Pavel's paper from 2007 from Asia BSDCon, porting the ZFS file system to the ZFS file system to the FreeBSD operating system. Too many systems in there. But we have a link to that paper if you want to see how the initial implementation was done to bring ZFS initially into FreeBSD, which pretty much kickstarted a renaissance in how we do all of our files in storage now. So definitely check that out. That's an interesting read. I remember being there for that year. I believe that was the year I was there. Yeah.
That was sadly long before I knew that I should be going to these type of things.
I think that was my first year going. I'll have to look back at my notes because I think I started doing BSDCan in 2006, and then I went to Asia BSDCon the following year. So that may have been the first year I went. But all the years run together now. It happens after a decade of doing this. But anyway, so tell us what's next. What do we have? A message from the foundation?
Yes, a message from the FreeBSD Foundation.
Okay.
Thanks.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you.
Thank you for making a difference.
Dankeschön.
Thank you.
Thank you.
谢谢.
Thank you.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone who made a donation to the foundation in 2016. Your donations will help us continue supporting the FreeBSD project and community worldwide in 2017. And if you haven't made a donation yet, please consider making a donation today. Thank you for your support.
So that was a nice little video they did. They had a very good year this year.
Very cool. All right, so what's our last one we got here, Alan?
Sadly, when Roger Faulkner died, we covered that on BSD Now. That was a while ago. But at the end of the year, they did a Remembering Roger Faulkner Unix Champion article over here at thenewstack.io. And I thought we'd highlight that because that was quite a good article going on there. And they also highlighted another one where there was a Usenix memorial by Brian Cantrill that was also covered this topic as well. So you might find lots of interesting stuff here. There's also a Hacker News thread with a couple of personal stories, which were quite interesting as well.
Okay. Yeah, you're remembering some of those we lost in 2016. Well, that's good stuff. Thanks for bringing us that, Alan. Okay, well, before we get into feedback and questions, because that's up next, we got our last sponsor this week. And look, we're going to be talking about TarSnap, so you know it's coming. You've been around a while. Or maybe you're new, in which case you better pay attention. So tarsnap.com/BSD Now. We kind of referenced it in one of the early articles talking about truly being paranoid. But TarSnap really is backups for the truly paranoid. Not only do they give you the source code so you can compile it yourself, but it also makes some pretty astounding claims, which it backs up quite successfully, I might add, where all your backups are done properly. Everything's encrypted on your end with your key before a single bit is sent out over the wire, which means when your bits land up on the cloud somewhere, you don't have to worry about somebody being able to see it or a government agency being able to get access to it or a rogue employee accidentally or intentionally leaking access to your data. Oh, no. You only have the key.
Yep.
So if you want that data to go away, since you can't ever really be sure you've deleted it out of the cloud, I mean, who knows how many tapes it's backed up on and disks and whatnot, you can just shred your key. rendering that data pretty much worthless at that point. Yep. So, of course, definitely back up your key, print it out. He even has it in a nice format that prints it out on one sheet of paper, which is pretty slick.
Checksum per line, so if you have to type it in manually, you can figure out which line you made the mistake on.
Yep, all those little touches that just make it easier. So it's definitely good stuff. You'll want to check it out today. It's super cheap, especially if you're doing redundant data, duplicated data. It's just going to back up the things that have changed. So
one of the
small diffs.
One of the cool things about Tarsnap is the way it does the data. So unlike most other things, it doesn't break your data up into fixed size blocks, like 4 kilobytes or something. It has an algorithm to actually find the best size block, and it can change after the fact. So the deduplication is smarter than usual deduplication, right? If you did if you broke up a sentence into 4 character blocks and you change one word, like add a letter, that's going to change every block. Or if you just change, his to her or something like that, then it will. If you change a word with the same number of letters, so you don't offset everything. But if that happens to be in the middle of a boundary, you're going to change both blocks. Well, the Tarsnap deduplication system will actually figure this out and break around the changes in the blocks so that this is not going to end up creating a bigger backup than necessary.
So saving you time and money.
So you take all your data and you segment it and deduplicate it and find only the blocks that have actually changed. Then you take that and compress it because a lot of the files on other than your media files, like pictures and videos, almost everything else is compressible. Then you encrypt and sign it with your key. So the encryption makes sure that nobody else can read it, and the signature makes sure that nobody can modify it. Then, only then, do you actually send it off into the cloud. Because even once it's in the cloud, there are so many backups and copies, and nobody actually knows what Amazon does underneath. Or nobody knows exactly what Amazon does with their dead hard drives even.
Right.
You can never be sure. But because it was encrypted on your machine before it left your machine with source code that you can look at to make sure it's actually encrypting it and not doing anything wrong, and then upload it, you can feel safe that your key is the only way to access that data.
Yeah, that's really the only way to do this, guys. And it's the beginning of the new year. A lot of folks make New Year's resolutions and probably have broken them by now. But this is one you really should keep.
And I put in $20 and I haven't managed to spend an entire dollar yet.
Yeah, mine's the same way. I put in $20 a couple of years back, and it's still going. So definitely check it out today, folks. Tarsnap.com/BSD Now and get signed up.
Maybe your New Year's resolution could be to make sure your backups are still happening, and maybe test one of them and make sure the backup, you're actually backing up the files you think you are. Because while Tarsnap probably isn't going to have a problem, your configuration of it could.
Yeah, make sure you're doing the right thing.
Oh, I forgot. I created this new directory over here of files I really want to back up, and I forgot that I'm not backing them up.
Yeah, it doesn't exist in the right location, or that was a symlink, or who knows. But definitely check it out today. Back it up with Tarsnap. Do it right. Okay, so we got some questions to get to here. So first up is Peter. He says, I've been having trouble installing TrueOS on my laptop. He says he has a Toshiba Satellite L855-S5405. He said, I put in a 256 gig Samsung SSD hard drive in the computer, 4 gigs of RAM, Atheros NIC, and a ZFS file system installed. He says, the problem is I don't get any internet connection through the LAN or through the Wi-Fi. He said, I'm guessing it's the Atheros NIC, but it seems at least I should get an internet connection through the LAN. That's interesting. He says, by the way, the Wi-Fi and LAN were working both before I installed TrueOS. Well, what OS? Was that Windows it was working on? It depends on who has what drivers. He said, at the end of the installation, I rebooted, but I don't seem to understand when to remove. I don't see or understand when to remove the USB installation drive. Well, when you're done with the install, you can remove it at that point and then just reboot. But he says he doesn't believe he's been able to connect to the LAN or internet. So my recommendation, since I'm not exactly clear on what model NIC you have on that, and even looking up the model number of the laptop, I mean, shoot, those can change. So if you could go post, on another system, go post on our forums with the PCI config /LV output. That would help a lot, so we can identify what kind of NICs you have in there and see what driver is supposed to be attaching to those and if it's supported or not. So definitely send that over or open it up as a ticket if you'd like to do that on github.com/TrueOS.
Yeah, like even maybe just running was it ifconfig -L?
Yeah. L will list all the devices. I was assuming that that's not working because by default we turn DHCP on for all the NICs, and that should just work. But
because if you have no network, it's harder to copy and paste the output of PCI compromise something. You could use the USB stick to shuttle it back and forth because otherwise,
it is a little bit of a pain. There's a bit of data, but yeah, if config-l first, let's see what kind of NICs you have there, and then go open up a ticket or post on the forums. We'll see if we can help you out and figure out what's wrong with it, and if it's a driver thing, maybe have some recommendations how we can fix that.
You might try getting just a USB Ethernet adapter, like one that actually has a LAN Ethernet connector, because almost all of those just work because it's a fairly generic thing. And just trying that, and if that works, then at least it gives you enough to go forward and figure out why the other part's not working. Because I think most of the Atheros NICs I've ever had have always worked.
Yeah, they typically just do. Yeah. So I'll be curious to see some of that output from your box so we can figure out exactly what's going wrong. Okay, so next up is Chris, who writes in. He says, hello, Chris and Alan. I'm currently sitting at a Windows PC as my workstation. I have a TrueOS desktop PC installed in the next room. How would I get remote access to the graphical desktop of a TrueOS PC from the Windows PC? He's like, basically, how do I RDP into the TrueOS box? He said RDP itself wouldn't be available, but how about VNC or X2Go, or is there a better Windows solution? So VNC, of course, works. You can do that. I think there's a couple different VNCs in the ports.
I like Type VNC, like Tiger. But actually, I think RDP is available, right? There's free RDP.
Yeah, there's an RDP solution, which it kind of lies. It ends up doing some VNC stuff in the background. I looked at it a lot when we were doing the Pico. Yeah. But anyway, you could
the main advantage is the RDP client built into Windows will work with it, whereas with VNC, you have to download a VNC client.
Yes. Yeah. So you can definitely do that.
VNC has better integration with Unix, so you can kind of go either way.
Yeah, and you can start the VNC client from the desktop session. So after you've already logged into the desktop, you can run a couple commands. It listens on a port, and then you can VNC, and you're good to go. I believe in the configuration tools, we used to have it. I think it's been ported over, but there was an option to turn VNC on at the login prompt. So you can even VNC into the box when you're logged out of the desktop, log in, and then do your session. And when you exit, it'll close out and start a new VNC session. So there's a couple different ways you can do it, and I believe that's in the handbook still. So definitely check that out, and hope that helps.
I know we had a VNC tutorial in one of the old tutorials we did. It was for running a browser in a jail, if I'm not mistaken, but it might also be helpful for setting up VNC.
Okay, cool. Okay, you want to take the next one here, Alan?
So this is a question about Geli on Serial. This is first, I want to thank you for the awesome show with Alan and Chris, and Alan specifically for the changes to ZFS boot to allow booting from an encrypted disk without using grub. So now to my question. My server is running FreeBSD 10.3/TrueOS with encrypted disk using Geli and grub as bootloader. This works fine. I'm able to enter the Geli password using the serial console. My new test setup uses FreeBSD 11 and is also encrypted using Geli, but with the ZFS boot instead of grub. This works fine via VGA, but as boot.config is on the encrypted drive, it's not read before the system prompts for the Geli password. Yes, I don't think Serial is started until the loader, which is loaded from the encrypted drive, so the password prompt is before that. It depends what kind of Serial you have, I imagine. If you're actually using like Serial over LAN with Serial redirection, I think this will work over Serial. But for just a regular like desktop PC or whatever with a Serial port, it might be slightly more complicated. I'm going to have to experiment with this a little bit. I don't know if it's possible just because that early in the bootloader, I don't know that we actually have enough code to enable
Serial. Is there
Serial.
enough room to import Serial stuff into there or not?
But yeah, I'll try it on one of my servers that actually has like the IPMI Serial over LAN. And if I can get it working there, then I will try maybe even a more generic regular Serial setup.
Okay. Very cool.
But yeah, basically, if you have the type of Serial where you can access the BIOS, it'll probably work. If you have the type of Serial where you can't go into the BIOS of a Serial, then it probably won't work.
Okay. Yeah. Well, cool. Well, so I'm looking into that. Sounds like it needs to take place. Okay, here. So I'll let you take the next one too, Alan. I think I'll grab the last one.
So this one's from Joseph asking about BGP and Vultr, which is a virtual service provider. This is Alan, Chris, and JT. I really enjoyed the show, and I've been running FreeBSD instead of Linux for my personal servers for the last few years because Alan was always talking about on TechSnap and ZFS and jails and so on. So I run a few $5 VMs on DigitalOcean and on Vultr to host my own DNS via Bind. Relay mail via Postfix and host a website via Nginx, each running on its own jail and all configured with Puppet. I'm attempting to set up the bird daemon to do BGP on a pair of OpenBSD VMs on Vultr to do automatic failover of a floating IP address. When I start the bird daemon, I get the error, socket error, kernel does not support TCP MD5 signatures. It seems that the generic FreeBSD kernel is compiled without the TCP signatures options. I really don't want to have to compile a custom kernel. Well, it's not that much work to do it. I don't know if turning that option on means that everything has a signature always, in which case it makes sense why it's off by default. Although it might be something that could be set with a tunable instead, but I think it's complicated enough that it's normally not done that way. He says, is there a reason this functionality is only available with custom kernels? I'm not sure. I think it might come down to just that most people's servers don't do BGP, but it's becoming more common of a thing, so maybe it will. It also depends, in your case where you're just talking to Vultr to do the BGP session and not necessarily actually announcing a /24 or something, they might not actually need MD5. I don't know if Bird can work without it or not. But yeah, the custom kernel is quite easy to do, so it might be your easiest option for now. He says,
it's probably more he just doesn't want to have to do updates manually, right? He wants to just build FreeBSD update and go.
He says, unfortunately, the Vultr docs only cover doing this on Linux, and I'm having trouble translating the instructions. He instructed me to set up a floating IP on a dummy interface in Linux, but I can't figure out the right way to do this on FreeBSD. I don't think you'd actually want it on a dummy interface on FreeBSD. He says, I've Googled DummyNet. DummyNet is completely unrelated. That's a traffic shaping tool. It's unrelated to the dummy interface on Linux. Anyway, he's thanks for the awesome show, and he mentions a URL to give us more detail.
Okay. Cool.
I know some people that do BGP and OpenBGPD on FreeBSD, but I think all of them do use the TCP option. Okay. I'm gonna have to look into it a bit and see if it makes if it would be possible to enable that option, or if it's the way it works isn't really compatible with being on by default.
Okay. Well, we'll do some research. We'll have to get back to you on that. Okay, so last up we have, looks like Alejandro writes in. He says, hello, Alan and Chris. I've started listening to your show a few months ago, and I'm totally hooked now. Well, that's good to hear. He said, although I've been tinkering with Linux for a few years, I've considered switching over to FreeBSD or TrueOS for my desktop and laptop PCs. I'm curious if there's a micro-sized version of any BSD that might be suitable for flashing on, say, a consumer-grade Wi-Fi router. He said something comparable to OpenWRT. He said, I know Alan mentioned in a recent episode about attaching a consumer Wi-Fi router to a pfSense box in order to provide Wi-Fi in addition to the firewall. And while I plan to set up a pfSense box at some point, I would be interested in starting with a simpler project like flashing a Linksys WRT54G with a BSD OS, if such a thing is even possible. Thanks in advance, and keep all the great content coming.
So there is a tool to do it, but I would definitely say it's more complicated than running pfSense on a machine. If you go to github/FreeBSD/FreeBSD-Wi-Fi-build, there's some scripts to actually compile a version of FreeBSD for MIPS, which is what most of these little routers use. That's 8 megabytes in size and gives you basically an image you can flash onto it. And in the wiki, they have the instructions for about 16 or 20 different routers and how to do it. Some of them, like the TP-Link WDR3600 I have, require you to solder on the connectors for the serial port before you can do this, which might be a bit more than you're looking to do. Although, admittedly, for that TP-Link, you can actually flash it. You go into the Linux web interface of the OS that comes on the router, and via its firmware update mechanism, give it the FreeBSD image, and it will install that. But the second time, you're going to want the serial console.
Sure.
Okay. So, yeah, it's a more involved project. It involves basically cross-compiling a custom version of BSD, and then for that specific hardware, and then
shrinking it down.
Yeah, the biggest problem is that most of these only have 8 megabytes of flash in them, and getting the entirety of FreeBSD down to 8 megabytes is a bit complicated at the moment.
Yeah, that's a little challenging.
So, I got it working on my DV-Link, but I had a firewall that could do NAT, but I didn't have a DHCP server, making it not all that useful.
Yeah, that's a little difficult.
Mostly I've just run out of time to keep working on it.
Sure.
But yes,
It's cool though.
there's that. And then there's the other one is, I think it's Z-Router is called, is a project for to do from somebody that worked at D-Link to do some FreeBSD based small routers like that.
I'm not
So there's work in that direction, but not enough has been done to give you quite something like OpenWRT.
Sure.
It's definitely more along I want to hack on it and I want to SSH into I want to serial into my little router and configure the firewall by typing commands. There's no web interface stuff to it yet.
Sure. Well, we wish you luck with that. If you still end up doing it, document what you do. Maybe you'll find some other.
But definitely check out that
consultants
wiki.
who
It
wanna
has a
help
lot of information on doing stuff. I've also used that to build images for the Onion Omega little device. I've not actually made that into a router, but it could be because it has an Atheros Wi-Fi with drivers that work and an Atheros physical NIC, but it only has one. So it's, but it could very easily be made into the Wi-Fi component that you would plug into one of the, connect your PFSense to provide the Wi-Fi.
Sure, yeah, that'd be really cool.
So it can be done, but it's quite a bit of manual work at the moment. But if enough of us keep working on it and putting our bits together in that repo on GitHub, hopefully sometday we can have BSD WRT.
Have like a standalone product where you could download it and flash it and be done.
It's like if you have one of these many routers, you'll be able to just
supported devices. I sense a future hacking lounge session to do something like that. Good stuff. Okay, well, we're wrapping up the show. That's it for us this week, folks. So we want to remind you, of course, going into the new year, maybe new folks are listening, we have an email address, feedback@bsdnow.tv. That's where you send everything in, right? So send it in there. I mean, you can write comments on Twitter or YouTube or whatever. Great. You can discuss amongst yourselves, but me and Alan probably won't see those. So try and send everything you want us to see into feedback@bsdnow.tv, and we'll throw it in the queue. And if you have a question, we'll queue it up for a future episode. So we are usually a couple weeks behind, though. We have enough stuff coming in that it takes us a while to get to it. So don't panic if you don't hear from us right away. We will get to your question in all in due time. Of course, if you have show ideas or topics or stories you find when you're out doing your daily web browsing, send those over to us as well. There's a lot of good stuff that gets sent in, and that's how we make the content for the show, just because me and Alan don't read every site every single day and catch every article. Same with JT. So definitely keep sending that stuff in, and we'll be happy to share it amongst the greater audience here. And we'll look forward to having another great episode next week. So wishing you all a good 2017, and looking forward to bringing you some more exciting BSD content down the road.